Okay, we want to finish up talking about populations, spending a little time talking about human populations and using some of the terminology and variables that we've learned about populations, applying them to humans, but where we stand in the context of populations. That's not going to take long, maybe 20 minutes, something like that. And then I will be happy to revisit any of the topics that you guys want to cover, with any questions you have. Preparation for the exam. How'd things go with John's lecture? You guys were good? That's all square? Made sense? Good? I hope you recorded it. I did not see it on the... I gave him the directions on how to record it, so I'll see if he has done that.
Is this stuff going to be on the next exam too?
No, Monday's exam will only cover the population material that we've covered together. The stuff John covered on competition and speaking interaction will be in the next exam. Okay? All right. So you may know from these kits like 23andMe and some of the most recent work that's been done that historically people used to think that humans evolved effectively from Neanderthals and other versions of the Homo genus. We're in the genus Homo, and we are the species Sapiens. But it turns out that these two types of humanoids, humans, if you will, co-occurred, and you can look into your genetic composition and find out basically how much Neanderthal you've got in your historical past. So you can see that the map here from this particular publication that I picked up indicates human origin in the context of Homo sapiens in Africa 200,000 years ago. And what you can see from this map is sort of the issue of human distribution over time, with the generic idea that we came out of Africa and then colonized into Asia. And it wasn't until relatively recently, 15,000 years ago, something like that, that the human population crossed the Bering Sea Bridge and populated the Americas. Now, if you think about getting it down into the southern portion of the United States about 12,000 years ago, that's about the time of the end of the Ice Age and moving into the interglacial. And that makes sense because during the Ice Age, the ocean's water, the fresh water on land, is sequestered into that ice, right? And that lowers the levels of the ocean because the water's pulled into ice in the poles. That exposes the land bridge between the two continents, and the migration is possible. The point to take home here is that people have been on the earth everywhere they're going to be for something like 10,000 years. So this isn't an issue of colonization. It's not like there are places we haven't gotten to yet. The species has distributed itself globally and has been that way for about 10,000 years.
There's been recent evidence using human race from South America that indicate that humans actually reached South America earlier than 12,000 years ago, probably between 13,000 and 14,000 years ago, which is halfway.
13 to 14,000 years ago in South Africa, or South America. And I recently read a fairly controversial paper suggesting that initially the whole idea was that this southern African origin that then spread them into different parts of Africa. And I just read this paper where they dug up these remains suggesting that this more ancient version of humans was far more widespread in Africa than they initially thought. It's still fairly controversial. I mean, this is an entire field of archaeology and anthropology and biology, that I really know very little about. But what I wanted to be able to sort of portray to you was that, remember when we started talking about populations, we talked about distribution. Are they there or are they not? For humans, we've been, or we are, everywhere we're going to be, to some degree, for thousands of years. If we look at the distribution of humans by population, the typical human on the planet is an Asian. somewhere between 60%, around 60%. So most of the human population is concentrated in Asia, and then you can see the distribution by the major continents here. So the dominance by Asians is something we that's not news to us, right? You get this sense that there are a lot of Chinese nationals. Asia is much bigger than just China, but that's actually changing quite rapidly, and I'll show you that that's the case. If we look at the distribution in the context of population densities, we can go back to that argument that at very large scales, populations are clumped, right? There are areas of high density and then there are areas of low density. And that's what the map is showing here. Here's the geographic distribution of human population density. So this is the numbers of individuals per square kilometer across the globe. And what you can see is that there are areas of really intense density. Manila in the Philippines, 41,000 people per square kilometer. In Mumbai in India, 28,000, almost 29. Dhaka, about the same. Interestingly, Paris is in fact quite dense. There's an example of a Western European location of very high density. And then there's a place in outside of New York City in Gutenberg that's got almost 23,000 people per square kilometer. So you can see that there are real hot spots of density where people live in very high abundance in very small areas. If we lay this out, sort of zoom in on the United States and see a picture of where we live, you can see by this, these are basically histograms where the height of the spikes are corresponding to higher density communities. And what obviously is striking is that the vast majority of people live in metropolitan areas, and the vast majority of them are in the east, and the vast majority of them are on the Atlantic seaboard right there. My cousin lives in Maryland, and he makes this joke about if you ask somebody from the east to draw a map of the United States, they'll draw Boston, New York, D.C., Miami, Denver, and L.A. Pretty much it. And that's a pretty good coverage of the population. Although Houston is now quite a large city. I think it's the third largest city in the nation now, Houston is. And the other striking thing, of course, is look at us out here. I mean, there's a large portion of the West that has very low densities. And what's interesting about the images of the West is you think of these wide open plains and vast areas, and that's really true. But if you've traveled from the east to the west, this section right here is huge. It's just green, right? I mean, once you get out of the Appalachians and you're in Ohio and you're traveling across the Midwest, it's enormous. It's just green and relatively habitable. It's when you get out here and things get drier and more geographically variable that you get this sense of the great wide open. And there are portions of the United States that, as I've mentioned, are quite dense. There's that area in Gutenberg, 22,000. LA's got about 7,000 people per square kilometer. San Francisco, Boston, Chicago. How does that compare to us? Oh, I wanted to point out the highest number I found was actually in D.C. in a place called Friendship Village, at about 82,000 people per kilometer. That's got to be some high-rise facilities, right? But if you look at Montana, we're a little lower.
That's the whole state?
Yeah, that's the statewide average. That's 6 people per square kilometer. So you can imagine that if you take Billings, Great Falls, Helena, Missoula, Bozeman, and pull them off the map, that number goes down, right? There are only 2 other states less densely populated than ours. Which ones are they? Wyoming and Alaska, right? How many people in Montana? Just barely over a million. It's like 1.07. We just tripped over a million. And Wyoming doesn't quite have a million in it. age distribution suggests that the rates of change are not evenly distributed. If you go look at different human populations, and we'll use age distributions. Remember, we were talking about the numbers of individuals or the proportions of individuals in different age classes can be used to sort of give us a sense of R, even though we don't have B and D for those things. We can expect if a population is declining, most of those members are going to be old. You're going to have relatively few youngsters. The population is growing, then the younger age classes are large, and they're moving into the older age classes. So here's an example of a growing population in Africa and Rwanda. And up in the left are the vital statistics that we talked about, right? So there's your birth rate and death rate, and B minus D will give you R. So a value of 0.018, how do we interpret that? What does that mean? That's the number of individuals being provided per female per year, and if we multiply it by 100, we could change it to a percent, right? So it's right about 1.8%. That's a substantial growth rate. Remember when people talk about economic growth rates, what's the rate at which the economy is growing? A 2% growth rate, not bad. It's like, for an economic growth rate, you like to see it up at 3 or maybe even 4. But for a population growth rate, that's a considerable increase in population. And you can see it so characteristically described in these large abundance, large numbers, percentages of young people mirrored pretty closely across male and female numbers. When would you expect male and female numbers to vary? I mean, if you were thinking about this from a biological point of view, would it make more sense for you to have your offspring be male or female? Well, it depends upon the abundance of the other sex, right? If you are faced with a situation where there's a large number of females, you'd want your offspring to be male. Because then there's a large number, you're not competing with the same type, and there's a large number of males. Well then, you'd make a lot of male offspring, and that would make them more abundant. And then it'd switch the other way. And so over evolutionary time, the sex ratio should be about 1 to 1. What causes a variation in that?
Policy.
What's that?
Policy.
Policy can do it. It did it in China, right? Where people responded to the fact that they could only have one child, unfortunately, through preferential infanticide. Female Chinese children were drowned in many cases. Why drown a female? They're more reproductively valuable. That has to do with the hierarchy and politics of social structure. What's the other thing that can do it? War. There's a beautiful, well, I don't know if you call it beautiful, there's a clear observation of this, illustration of this. If you look at the population of males in France, you can see the dent that World War I caused. It just wiped out an entire generation of young males. So the sex ratio was skewed as a result. Now here you can see it so nicely illustrated as being the same. Here's an example of a stable population. This is Lithuania, one of the Baltic states, Tbilisi here. And you can see that there's a pretty stable number of individuals in each of the size classes. It tapers as you get a little older, but that's what you'd expect with a human survivorship curve, right? Older age classes have higher mortality. But through these younger age classes, we see a pretty consistent representation. So that would have a relatively stable population. Then you could go to someplace like Hungary where you see the declining population. Maximum proportions occur here. Let's go back and look at that R value for the stable. It's pretty close to 1. It's an order of magnitude lower. If we go back to the growing one, there's 0.018, call it 0.02, and here it's 0.001. So it's an entire order of magnitude lower in terms of the rate at which that population is accumulating individuals. And then you can see for Hungary, the value is negative. So all those numbers make sense to us now. We understand what a birth rate is and how you calculate mortality over time, summing up your group to get a vital statistic like an R value. Here's the global picture. And what does it suggest?
We're getting bigger.
We're getting bigger. Well, I don't know if that's the right word. That would suggest that I'm getting fatter. Is that the point you're making here?
Yes.
Yeah, I was afraid of that. What's the more accurate way to say what Kelly tried to say there? We're not getting bigger. What's happening?
Population is increasing.
Population is increasing. What aspect of the population?
Younger generation.
Yeah, but give me the parameter. What is the value? Well, maybe. Can you tell that from here?
The survival rate?
All you can really tell from there is that your age class distribution suggests that N, population size, is increasing, right? We're getting bigger, doesn't quite get there, right? And you have to make sure you're using the right term. If you're talking about the total number of individuals in a population, that's N, that's the population size. That's different than population density, right? That's the number divided by area. So this distribution suggests that, and again, this is the distribution of the world population by age, suggests that the world population is growing. The population size is increasing. And that's true. And here's a picture of it sort of scanned out, pulled back in time over the last couple thousand years or so. And what you really see from this is an extraordinary stability for most of the Earth's history, right? And that really has to do with both the ability to feed the population, and as a result, feeding the population, allowing the population to respond to mortality. And this exponential increase right here has put us right about 7.7 billion. When I updated this from 7.5 billion, which is the number that was on there last time I gave the lecture. So this is changing as we speak. And you can go online and do a search for the global population, and they'll pull up this counter, and you can sit there and look at it. And it's pretty, I mean, it's spinning while we're talking, right? It's pretty amazing. There's another one for the national debt that kind of looks the same way.
If you value your mental health, don't watch that.
It is a little disturbing. So why did this do this? What was the number one thing that happened? When did it happen? Look at about 1800. Somewhere right around here. The United States becomes a country, independent country in 1776, and then...
The Industrial Revolution?
And what was that about? The Industrial Revolution. What was the number one thing that happened there? You're talking through your hand, I can't hear you, and you mumble. Why don't you guys give us a different verse?
Centralized production.
Centralized production, as compared to widely distributed. It has something to do with production, right? What was the thing that became available to drive production?
Technology.
Was that technology? What drove technology?
Wars.
What's that? Wars. Wars did have a big to do with this. But it basically has to do with power, right? First it was steam power, and then it became petroleum, gasoline, internal combustion engine. All of the stuff that goes with the ability to use chemistry to generate power. And the number one thing that changed the world's population was the ability to produce nitrogen. So nitrogen is an element, right? We know that. Where's most of the nitrogen in the world? In the atmosphere. And it's sitting up there as a nitrogen triple bonded to another nitrogen.
Would you mind going, I think it switched back.
Oh.
Thank you.
It's inert. You breathe it in, you breathe it out. Inert means it doesn't react. It's called a noble gas. It just goes in and out. And yet, we need nitrogen for muscles, for enzymes, for nucleic acids. All of that nitrogen is in forms we call reactive nitrogen, N sub R. So this is the reactive pool down in the biosphere. used in fertilizer, used by organisms, grows in plants, we eat it, we get it into us. And this is inert. And biological entities need nitrogen in a pretty large supply. I have a large demand for it compared to the supply in the biosphere. And so its availability tends to limit the rates of growth, and that's true for agricultural fields as well. So if you could figure out how to make more biologically available nitrogen, you can increase its availability, you can increase growth rates. And that process is called fixation. Nitrogen fixation. The idea of fixing something, we talked about this when we were talking about autotrophs. They fix carbon. They're a special type of organism that can take something that's inorganic and unavailable, turn it into a meaningful organic form. Right? And what was that meaningful organic form for carbon? What do the autotrophs turn it into?
Water.
Hold on. If we take carbon and you turn it into oxygen or you turn it into water, you're going to have a nuclear explosion involved. Right? You're changing element form. The only place that happens is in a sun or in a nuclear reactor. You can't do that. Living things can't do that. It's just destructive. Glucose. Turn it into sugar, right? You're transforming, building carbon-carbon bonds, making sugar. The organisms that do this are things like, well, they're all bacteria, but they hang out with plants. Peas and other legumes are nitrogen fixers because they have little bacteria that live in root nodules in their roots that can do this, which is where the idea of crop rotation came from. Alfalfa is a nitrogen fixer. So you put some alfalfa in there in between your corn, it's bringing in the nitrogen. But we've had to rely on that for thousands and thousands of years. And then, during World War II, this guy named Fritz Haber, who was just a really evil dude, but brilliant, was a chemist and figured out how to create most of the mustard gases and deadly gases that were used in World War I during the French warfare. He also figured out how to take nitrogen gas in a reactor, use petroleum for the energy, and make fertilizer out of it. His name was Fritz Haber. That was like he got the Nobel Prize for it. 1914, something like that. And then by 1919, a different German, a guy named Karl Bosch, he had figured out how to industrialize it. And so the Haber-Bosch process is industrial nitrogen fixation, and all of a sudden we had more fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer than we know what to do. And they make bombs out of it. Right? They're related to each other. You probably heard about saltpeter, potassium nitrate, and ammonium fuel oil. That's how they make bombs. It's all nitrogen energy stuff. So those chemists that were making bombs ended up being the guys that created the Haber-Bosch process. And this green line is the Haber-Bosch process. That means that if you have energy, you can make nitrogen available to crops. If you can grow more crops, you can grow more people. Who has the energy? Where does the energy come from? It takes energy to do that chemically. Where does that energy come from? Guess. Where does most of our energy come from in the West? Petroleum. Those countries that had oil were able to do this. Those countries that controlled oil, right? Because there were a lot of countries in the Mideast that had oil, but they were controlled by the English or by other colonial powers. That's how having the petroleum translated to having the nitrogen and translated to having the people. So those things are hand in hand as the single reason that world population exploded and continuing to grow. If you look at the distribution, though, in the context of who's contributing to a growing population, you'll see the shift in the world's future. So So here's the total population in billions. Here it is from 1950 to 2100. And look at North America. I mean, it is pretty close to, I mean, it's still going up, but it's pretty close to flatline. Latin America and the Caribbean, very small increases. What you see in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000 is a pretty striking increase in the contribution from Asia. But you'll also see that maxed out. In fact, it's projected to decline. And instead, what you'll see is a pretty serious contribution from Africa. So there's going to be a change in when you think about the typical human. What do they look like? Where are they from? And you can see that if you plot these in maps, where the maps represent the distributions of peoples and where they're from. We're familiar with this view of the Earth, right? Turns out it's not a very accurate view of the Earth in any real way. Because if you think about it, the Earth's surface is actually wrapped around as a globe, right? And if you tried to fit that picture around into a globe, it doesn't fit properly. This does not show you the proper sizes of the continent. Africa is far bigger than this picture shows it. If you've ever seen, if you get a chance, go online and look at look up an aerially accurate view of the globe. It's amazing.
So I'm assuming this is a Mercator projection, but the Greenland is like, it looks like it's half the size of Africa, but accurately it's 1/10 of the size of Africa.
Yeah, because in order to make those areas visible, they expand at the poles and they contract at the equator.
It's also really Eurocentric.
Yeah, I guess so. Have you ever seen one where like Australia is at the top? It's really weird.
There's a bit from, and I'm saying this because I actually think it was really educational, a bit from the West Wing, where they had a person come in and ask them why we have the maps the way they do. We could just completely switch it up and have an entirely different view of the world that isn't as Eurocentric. It's really interesting.
Yeah. It has everything to do with rates of technology and colonialism and world history. So here's what it looked like back in the day. If you looked at the distribution of people on the land and you changed the size of the continents as a result of where the people were, in 1800 it looked like that. There weren't very many people in the Americas and the world population was dominated by Asia. And here's what you expect it to look like in 2100. You can see the influence that Africa will have on world population, and Africa and Asia as dominant composition. And that's got everything to do with rates of population change, right? Having said that, we have to make sure we understand the difference between the rate of change and the fact that something is growing. If you look at this, axis, it's in percent. So here's a 1% change, right? Oops, sorry. There's a 1% change right there. So these changes that we're mapping here are somewhere between 1 or 2%. But notice everything is above the zero line, right? So anything that's plotted is a positive change. Therefore, the population is growing. But this is the rate of change in the population, right? And what you can see is that those rates were higher in the 70s and 80s than they have been for the last 20 or 30 years. And there's a clear decline in the rate of increase, right? So if you're plotting the slope, it's starting to plotting that line, it's starting to flatten off a little bit. And this is encouraging in the context of this is starting to act like logistic growth, right? Remember when we were modeling population change, we were talking about exponential change, which we saw if we plot the human population and the inflection point is the Haber-Bosch process, it looks very much exponential. But when there's feedback from 1 minus n over k, it starts to flatten out and we'd expect something up here, right? But the concern is that we'll overshoot K and there'll be mass famine and it'll be down here somewhere. I guess that would be negative population. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, that it's going to have, worldwide famine, some sort of crash. These data suggest we might be entering that tapering environment. We're still growing. This is all still positive, but there's the suggestion that the rate of growth is declining and we may be converging on the carrying capacity, where R is 0, right? And N is a constant value. This suggests that around 2100 we'll still have a positive rate of growth. So I just switched this over to R values so you could see the corresponding behavior. Remember we saw a very stable population in Estonia at about 0.001. What was that? Rwanda at almost 0.02. And you can see that is 0.02 up here. So you can see that those are for a lot higher. And this is this is the world. But at some point, the world was behaving. Everything was behaving like Rwanda, and we can clearly see that that's no longer the case. So this idea of having a carrying capacity has been revisited recently in the global context, and that idea of what are called planetary boundaries. And here Steve Running from the University of Montana published a paper in Nature saying, what ultimately matters here in the context of human population is the ability to obtain the food resources required to function as a heterotroph, right? And where do those food resources come from? What's the energy source for food on the planet? It's not petroleum. It's what? It's solar energy. What's the process by which inorganic carbon becomes fixed as organic carbon? What's that called? You don't have to raise your hand.
Is it photosynthesis?
Photosynthesis is the chemical process that occurs inside those autotroph cells that cause this to happen. When we think about it at a larger scale, what do we call it?
Carbon fixation.
What's that?
Carbon fixation.
Carbon fixation is that process which defines an autotroph. It's carried out usually by photoautotrophy through photosynthesis. It results in a rate of primary production. Production, primary. First production, right? So rates of primary production are the rates at which autotrophy, carbon fixation, photosynthesis, all those things end up manifesting in the growth of new green stuff. And that's where everything else gets its energy. Right? There's no herbivore that makes its own food. There's no carnivore that makes its own food. It's all tied to that primary production base. So the Earth's ability to expand as a consumer is constrained by the Earth's ability to function as a producer. Right? So what Running was saying is, let's take a look at the rates of primary production and how much slack there is in them. How much could we increase our use of primary production? And he argues that that will ultimately limit human population growth. So here is a full pie chart of the available net primary production on the land, and on the globe. What that means is plants fix carbon using light energy. They have to pay for their behavior, so they have to burn some of it. And the result is net primary production. It manifests usually as increased plant biomass. Your plants grow and then you harvest them. If we look at the rate that the entire globe has available, this is the amount that humans are currently utilizing right over here, this blue wedge. So we use about 40% of the land's net primary productivity. That's encouraging. That means 60% of the stuff is still out there for us to potentially use to support humans, right? And then it gets a little bit more problematic. Turns out that 28% of the rest of that thing is underground and it goes to roots. It's basically support structure. You gotta have it. It's like paying the piper. Yeah, it's still primary production, but it's growing a root system that we really don't eat. That's a bunch of like vascular tissue used to move stuff around. There's no sugars in it. It's really not very good. Okay, well, we lost that part. And then it turns out there's a pretty big chunk of it, about 22% of it, you just can't get to. It's not available to humans. It's in environments that we really can't harvest, we really can't get to it. And so what that means is we have about 10% of slack. And my guess is that if you took the current population and you added 10% to it, that's probably not viewed right now as the K value for the planet. That's probably not the population at which we're going to level off. So what does that mean? We're going to overshoot and crash. That's one hypothesis. The other thing it means is we have to change that number. We have to change the total planetary primary production. How do we do that?
New tech. Just new technology, so we get more out of it. We can artificially produce more food.
What sort of technology does that? GMOs. What's a GMO? You all know what a GMO is, don't you? And it's scary because the idea of purposely altering genetic composition to change the way organisms behave, isn't too far from Frankenstein. Or cloning and all these weird things that then evoke this idea of the big brother state reproducing armies of clones or something like that. The truth of the matter is that it's going on right now. It's not a question of will we do it. We are doing it. And in the very near future, people's attitudes about it will change hugely because we'll run out of food. The United States hasn't really had this problem for some time. We are ridiculously rich. The amount of energy we employ individually, each of us, is absurdly high compared to other countries. But when our way of life and our resources are being threatened by coordinated attack, we will change the way we view about it, the way we view this. So lots of times we think about ethical dilemmas that we're going to face. And the fact is we are facing them right now. It just hasn't hit home in our front yard. So these are things you guys will deal with as your generation becomes my age. Okay, any questions on human populations or any of the ideas we applied? Kent?
Why would they predict Africa's population to spike so much?
It has everything to do with age distribution. So they have a large young population. They have an enormous quantity of untapped natural resources. The degree to which those natural resources have been developed, that is, moved into industrial processing, moved into food processing, is minor. And this simply has to do with the ability to coordinate the people and establish so my wife Sherry teaches here in the International Business Program, and she emphasizes that social and political stability are the two primary determinants of economic prosperity. If you don't have happy people, you don't have a stable government. And if you don't have a stable government, you can't develop your economics. And so the issues of the social and political issues in Africa have kept it less well developed. And it is going to become developed. It's a giant untapped resource. And which country right now is more invested in Africa than any other in the world? China. Right? So there's a whole series of global efforts the Chinese are making because they're thousands and thousands of years old. And they're thinking hundreds of years down the line. And how old are we? About 200. I mean, we are ridiculously young. If you think about the behavior of the United States, we're very much like a rich, petulant, powerful child. That's just the way it goes. Okay? Any other questions about humans? Human population? All right. Well, with that, I'm pretty much done lecturing about populations. And you're all free to go. Unless, of course, you have looked at your material and you have questions and things you want to cover. And I would take it from this barrage of questions that you have not done.
Can I get a brief explanation of 1 minus n over k as well?
1 minus n over k. All right, let's do this as a group. Ryan, what does 1 minus n over k refer to? What is it generically? Well, it's in the parentheses, right? It's a number, 1 minus n over k. What's it supposed to do? Okay, it's going to influence the rate of change. How is it going to influence that rate of change? Very good. How is this thing in parentheses supposed to influence the rate of change? What do we call that thing in the parentheses? You guys you're nowhere near ready for this exam, aren't you? It's a dampening factor. What is it dampening? What's that?
Said population.
Well, if it's dampening population, you have to take it around and beat things on the head with it. I need more accuracy. Matt, what is that dampening? That's right. It's dampening an equation for population growth. It is part of the logistic equation. What part of the logistic equation is it dampening? More specifically, what type of growth rate? The intrinsic growth rate, R sub m. That's that thing that's set by evolution. That's your maximum rate of growth if you have all the resources in the world. And that thing in the parentheses is dampening it, right? But we don't want it to shut it down completely. Like if it exists, then rates are really low. Because in order to map exponential growth for logistic growth, we need it to grow fast down here, and then we need it to slow down and stop up here. So that thing in the parentheses should have variable influence. It should have very small influence when population sizes are small, and it should have a strong influence and dampen and shut down growth when population sizes are large. That's why it's 1 minus n over k. What's the variable in that parentheses? Randy? N. What's the constant, Phil? K. What's K? Carrying capacity. And carrying capacity is what? Give me a definition.
The max number of individuals that can be in a population.
Maximum number of individuals in a population. What do you think of that? Joe? Is that a legitimate call?
I think so.
It's not. You can overshoot K. Right? That's a classic test question. People are like, oh yeah, it's a max. No, you could go over it. It's just not a good idea.
But the environment can sustain.
Because the environment can sustain. Right? The idea you're going to bounce around this thing, but you could sustain it over a long period of time. That would make it, Kirsten, a characteristic of the environment or of the population?
Population.
It's both. If you define it like you did, it's characteristic of the environment. If you define it as the maximum population size that can be sustained, that makes it a characteristic of a population. It's driven by the environment, though, right? So that's why 1 minus n over k is in there. Their idea was, let's model the population as if it were growing exponentially, which we know it can't sustain. To grow exponentially, you've got to have overlapping generations, you've got to have continuous reproduction, and you've got to have unfettered resources, right? It's a perfect test question. What are the 3 things required for exponential growth, right? And you name those 3 and you get all the points. But you can't maintain it because resources aren't unlimiting. As the population begins to grow, it starts running out of resources. You get that feedback on the exponential growth that comes from that dampening factor. What's really happening is that R is changing, right? R is the real variable. They just decided to use R max and dampen it because it's easier to do. Easier to model that way. Other questions about population? No? Okay, so there are a number of students in here that scored really well. If I look at the distribution of the exam scores from the last exam, 40% of you got A's or B's, but 40% of you got D's or F's. That means half of the class is really on top of this, and the other half of the class is just not. And then there's a little, like 18% C's. It's completely inverted from what professor would like to see. I'd like to see a normal curve. And for me, that means that, some of you got a good sense of how prepared you need to be, and some of you didn't. So there are some folks in here who scored really well. I'd like to hear from them about what they did to be prepared for that. So if you did well on the exam, can you tell us what you did? How did you study?
I use Quizlet, and I'll copy and paste all the terms and the notes into a thing. And I always start off using the multiple choice, so I get a vague idea of what the answer. Everyone knows what Quizlet is, so. But
Joe might be like.
yeah. But so I tend to use tests on a multiple choice thing only, and then I'll move on to doing flashcards or fill in the blanks. And you just move through the different study techniques and find whatever works for you. And so I scored a B, which is not super great, but it's
pretty
still
good.
Pretty all right. So that's.
Do you have to feed Quizlet information?
Yeah.
And then it turns around and generates questions for you?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Anybody else? Pardon?
I did something similar, but I just made actual note cards. I just had a night. In order for me to study, I always have to make it enjoyable for myself. So,
Yeah.
I played some music and lit some candles and got my favorite kind of dinner, and then I did homework. But then I just made flashcards for all the things that looked like vocab words on the slides, and I honestly only needed to go through them once or twice because writing them out really helps me.
Writing them out is critical. What writing them out does is it makes you take it off the page and into your brain, and then you put it back down. If you just go home and rewrite your notes at the end of the day, you wouldn't have to study. But nobody goes home every day and rewrites their notes, right? But if you wait till the night before the exam and try to rewrite all your notes, it's too much work. Break it up into a couple of nights. You've still got time, right? You got till Monday at 2.
I have
Take some time to do that rewriting.
I also found that engaging in the lectures really helpful because it gives you something to anchor your knowledge to.
What do you mean by engaging in the lecture? Oh, when you're in here.
When I'm in here.
Oh, yeah.
When I ask questions and when I make comments, it's not to interrupt or derail. It's so that I can have it's like a mnemonic device for me. It's I made a comment.
Absolutely. In order to make a comment or answer a question, you have to be thinking. And it's easy as a student, and often the case as a student, you come in with relatively little energy. Your energy tapped. And when your energy tapped, usually say to yourself, well, I just haven't got it today. I'm just going to write this stuff down. I'll come back to it later. But you don't come back to it. And when you say that to yourself, you're saying, I'm not really going to learn this now. I'll listen and whatever, but I'm not really going to, bring it in. And then that means you've doubled your workload later. So if you could come to class with the energy required to really engage in anything I have to say, it's pretty clear. There's not really nothing I have to say that's really difficult to understand. It's just you've got to be willing to pay attention to it and learn it rather than just displace it and say, I'll deal with that later. So if you can get yourself, to bring the energy to bring the stuff in, it's relatively easy to do. Just don't wait to try to do it all at once, because then you get tapped out of energy and you're not as prepared as you need to be. You can change your scores. I mean, you may not believe me, but you should try it sometime. And when you're tired of studying, you know what you should do? Study some more. And when you think, boy, I really done a good job on that, do more of it. See how far you can go. It's just discipline, right? And if you do it once, and you started out really poorly, and your next exam score is really good, you can't believe what that feels like. It's not just about ecology. You can do it anywhere. And all of a sudden you're thinking, I've been underestimating my skill sets, which I guarantee you have been doing. Because you're all really smart people. You're in the university in the United States, for God's sake. You don't get in here without being smart. It's a matter of energy, right? And discipline. What are you laughing about?
That you have to be really smart to attend university. No, you just have to pay.
Well, that's not true. I can tell you that's not true. You do have to pay. But there are entrance standards, right? Yeah, but that's not what accounts for you guys being. And the behavior in your scores has not got a lot to do with how smart you are. It's got more to do with how disciplined you are. Any other questions about populations?
Do we have to plot anything on the exam, like make our graphs or
Well,
whatever?
that's a good idea. Yeah. I'll make a short answer, fill in the blank, you have to plot. You wanted that, didn't you?
No, I didn't.
You didn't?
I just wanted to know if you just.
Why didn't you want one of those? You have difficulty in making graphs?
Well,
You're probably better at it than you think. What if I asked you to plot logistic growth and name the shape of the graph? Luke, what would you do?
For exponential growth,
Logistic growth.
logistic growth, so it goes, and then instead of going straight by exponential growth, it starts to die off.
And what's it called? That shape? Anybody? Sigmoid. See? There you go. Okay? Get in touch with me if you need any, if you have any questions or anything. Good luck.